Next up is Roger Tollefsen, and on deck is Kevin McDonald.
Good afternoon. I've been involved with the seafood industry for over 35 years and trying to help save the bay. I've been doing that by doing extensive research and also going back and looking to see what actually is happening. And one of the things I found is with this group right now, is everybody has a consensus. The consensus is we want to save the bay. That's fine. But I ask you to stop for 1 minute and think about what is a harmful algae bloom. Okay, seems pretty obvious, right? Because everybody knows what a harmful algae bloom is, isn't it? And what do we do to equate to it? We equate to other estuaries that have had the problem and dealt with it in a certain way. They've reduced nitrogen, just like you're proposing. They've gone back and tried to work in those directions. But I can tell you that less than 1% of the estuaries in the United States have toxic algae bloom. That distinguishes us from everybody else. 1%. We are the international epicenter for toxic algae. And if we look for other estuaries to help and follow their same plans, we are going to make big mistakes. We already made a big mistake. We put the Southwest Sewer District in. And when we did that over 40 years ago, we started the downward spiral of losing everything that was dear to me. When I used to have a reception party for brides-to-be, nobody could do it in the fall because everybody was shucking or catching scallops. Now we can't get a year where even though the scallops start to grow, for some unknown reason, they all die. We've got a serious problem here. We can all agree with that, okay? The question is, how do we approach it? And you can't approach it until you define it. If we continue to go along the path of assuming we have too much nitrogen, because none of the data shows that, everything you look into the Peconic Estuary Program shows levels of nitrogen that are not only barely above the level of detection in the marine waters, they're going down. And Dr. Goldberg can't explain why. He has done experiments that went back to say, let's see what happens when we add nitrogen to our bay. And we put shellfish in there. In every one of those experiments, the shellfish grew faster. Our bays are are nitrogen limited. There's a term for it, oligotrophic, which is just a term, but essentially means they're starving. We are not the same as other estuaries. We share the same goals. I'm not trying to be derogatory to anybody here by speaking out, but because we've gone down a trail of going back and saying nitrogen is the #1 enemy and we have to demonize it and we don't want to have any more septic systems because we blame that, we are only going to make things worse. So that's all I've got to say today. But all I need to do is to encourage you to open up this conference somehow, to have a dialogue of people who have a different opinion. And if you're not aware that we're only 1% of the problems right now, and we are the toxic center for algae blooms in the United States, we don't deserve to move forward until we decide that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next up is, I'm sorry, we have a question. Yes, here we go. Who is first? Legislator Krupski.
Thank you. So you brought the challenge with the scallop population, and you also asked a question about what is a algae bloom. So what, in 2 words, how would you define algae bloom?
2 words in algae bloom? The harmful algae bloom is not the international accepted standard for a term which has too many definitions. It could be marine, it could be fresh, it could be toxic, or too much of the algae that form the basis of our important food web. The European standard only applies to toxic algae. But we throw out harmful algae bloom as if we know how to solve it. But we haven't defined what we're trying to solve. And since we have toxic algae blooms and very little evidence of any blooms of algae that are important to our bay that are in excess, we have the exact opposite. But we're trying to manage this system because we haven't decided what we want to do. So if I'm an engineer, I don't start to build something until I determine what I want to do. We have set in motions here through very slick marketing campaigns to go back and say we know what the solution is without ever discussing what we want. We have not defined the problem. And I disagree with Dr. Goldberg. As much as he's got tremendous credentials and he's worked on it very hard, I don't think he will disagree with me that the initiation of a bloom of toxic algae has been associated with low levels of inorganic nitrogen. While it's true, once it starts, just like a weed in your lawn, you fertilize it, you'll get more. It starts because it's low. And we've created situations that are going to make it lower. Sorry.
I was looking for, I was thinking brown tide, but you went in a different direction because what originally killed the scallops back in 1985 was a brown tide.
Well, the brown tide killed it for two reasons. One was, which has now been declared to be toxic. Dr. Goldberg himself put it on the list, of the European list, as a toxic algae. It's also a very, very small algae. And it's so small that the filter feeders, which what shellfish are, were not able to capture it. In fact, the Latin name for the species we call brown tide means a tiny little sphere capable of causing starvation. And that was such a dominant species that there were over 6 million cells per milliliter. It's bizarre. But there was nothing else there to eat, so they starved.
So do you know the cause of the scallop mortality now? Because scientists from Cornell University and Stony Brook University are doing, I think, a very good job of trying to figure out the cause of their mortality and the decline in the adult population.
Well, I think we should determine the cause of mortality before we design a system which is going to go back and take directions which may be anti what we're trying to do. It's very hard to change a design. Even though the Southwest Sewer District was in there for 40 years, we have made no effort to go back and evaluate to see if those shellfish are actually starving. We don't know if there's enough food in the system. In fact, the chlorophyll level that everybody's so concerned about, that if it's too much will cloud the waters, kill the eelgrass, and eventually make low oxygen conditions, is non-existent. So we don't have those types of blooms in our area. We do have other conditions that exist, but not those. We are toxic algae capital of the international world.
If you could contact my office, Dr. Tettelbach just sent me a paper that they've done on this, and I'll be happy to share it with you.
I would like to see that too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Legislator Fleming.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tollefsen. I certainly note your passion. Your comments were also addressed in the EIS, the environmental impact study for the subwatersheds plan, weren't they?
I put the comments in. I did not get the confirmation that we're going to talk about either a toxic algae or a excessive bloom. They're completely different. The Long Island Sound is too much of a good thing.
Okay, my question though is, your comments are included at the end of every FEIS, there's a list of comments and the lead agency's response.
Absolutely, yes.
They're in there, right? Thank you.
We haven't had an open discussion. It's a one-side discussion, which is the first discussion I got back and forth for anybody was you, Mr. Krupski. When you asked at the last meeting, you asked me a question about what we're trying to do. That's the first discussion I've got from any group for 25 years.
But you've had the opportunity, sir, on the 4 public hearings we had.
And I've been to almost all of them.
Exactly. And you certainly have had an opportunity to make your concerns be heard.
I've got no response.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, I have another question.
Sure.
Is it your position, I just want to be clear on that, is it your position that cesspools are okay? I mean, we have almost 400,000 failing cesspools that are injecting human waste into our water resources. Is it your position that we shouldn't do anything about them?
No. My position is there are septic systems that need to be replaced. Those are the ones that are in shallow water areas that are leaching directly into the water are ridiculous. They shouldn't have been put there in the first place. And that has to be addressed. But if you address it by capturing the nutrients that were in that septic system, even though there was pathogens associated to it, you got to be able to put it back. When we had the highest levels of harvest in our bays, we can count for how much nitrogen we took out with those harvests. It's physically impossible today because we don't have enough nitrogen in our system. That's simple.
Okay.